Marco is an architect. He studied in Ecuador and in the US, if I'm right. And he's currently a professor at the Universidad Central del Ecuador in Quito. So, Marco, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sergio, for your introduction, and thank you for everyone organizing this at ETSAM and also at FAO in Sao Paulo. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to start right away. Just let me put this in. Okay, so this presentation that I'm going to show you today is more than a research project, is just a comparison, an exercise that uses two mainstream architectural projects that address a common social problem and take the political as a disciplinary tool, opposing, in a sense, the architectural post-critical scene. First, we have Office for Political Innovations, the Rolling House for the Rolling Society, that was presented in 2009, which gives a form, or which gives form to a condition that was already happening in Europe, where students, migrants, and tourists were forced or are forced still, or at least before the pandemic, to share flats to save money on housing. On the other hand, we have Dogma and Black Squares like a Rolling Stone, which was presented in 2016. A project that was seeking to provide low-cost boarding housing in London for the emerging entrepreneur. Even though these two offices have diametrical opposite intellectual positions, as it is well known, both seems to coincide in coining the rolling metaphor to refer to a contemporary social rootlessness condition. Both projects' objective is to ameliorate, or at least to account for, the conditions of the actual hyper-alienated rootless subjects under contemporary post-Fordist forms of production. This preoccupation aims for bringing the political to the domestic, but in somewhat different approaches, by advancing what seems to be the final acceptance of the irrelevance of the architectural object per se, in a quest for overcoming the irrelevant political role of the post-critical architectural scene. Andres Jaque has acknowledged the domestic as the space for political agonism and antagonism. According to Jaque, this move towards object-oriented politics breeds hybrid objects. In a way, architecture, according to Jaque, as an ensemble of objects, it is social in itself. On the other hand, Pier Vittorio Aureli defines the relationship of architecture with politics, relying on the classical notion of the polis as the imminent archetypal political condition. For Aureli, the political emanates from the struggle between architecture and urbanization. For Jaque, the political enters the domestic, and domesticity is itself political and urban. Jaque starts his research by looking at unconventional subjects, both in human and in thematic terms. The project advances an alternative reading of the urbanization process affected by nascent gender questions and apps or digital technology that allows non-physical communication as quasi-objects that affect materially the domestic and the social. Jaque's project fully accepts the topological as found conditions of rolling housing in a diagrammatic manner. On the contrary, Dogma's research will try to get as closer as possible to archetypal examples that illuminate a proposed programmatic and formal genealogy. Nevertheless, in this project, like a Rolling Stone, it is atypical to a genealogy of boarding housing types. The project proposes a prototype that adapts strategically but not topologically in abandoned sites in London's Crossrail line. The avoidance of recognizing topology as a strategy might be coherent with Dogma and Aureli's radical dissociation with disciplinary conventions that evolved from the 1990s onwards, implying an evident return to historical codes. Dogma, in a way, is trying to save architecture from technological corruption or algorithms, postscripts, and parametrization. by re-engaging architectural autonomy to political concerns. In Like a Rolling Stone, the latter has been proven to be the means for autonomy. Uh, that is to say, politics is a way to separate architecture formally as oikos with the city as polis. Nevertheless, if the commitment to politics is formal, the disengagement with technology is pragmatic. Like a Rolling Stone eliminates any trace of the omnipresence of digitalization as part of everyday life. Concomitant to its techno rejection, Aureli project dwells on modernist poetic of the generic tectonics. Its minimal structure coincides with the minimal space for essential everyday activities. The dimensions of the individual units are based on a double-sized bed plus storage, and the generic base structure adds a minimal extra space for use and circulation. The rational measured interior, as opposed to the large, unstoppable, irrational interior of Hackett's non-stop rolling house, is reinforced with the neglect of techno-utopia, a rational techno-nostalgia. The Rolling House for the Rolling Society, on the other hand, recognizes a kind of infinite interior promoted by digital technology, communications, and the relatively simple way to travel among European cities as a kind of utopia already latent in the territory. Nevertheless, if there's a trace of utopia already latent in the territory, if there's a trace of utopia, it has nothing to do with a radical change in society at large, but in an attempt to activate this infinite interior politically. Thus, Hake takes the ordinary hybrid aspects of everyday life in temporary housing and assembles them in a conflictual way as a collage. The basic unit of this collage is the personal space formed by lightweight compartments, resembling the typical tent that adds to street level stores. These individual units are organized around a nucleus of communal activities, a highly decorated core that intermingles exposed mechanisms and domestic artifacts. Suddenly, everything becomes one charged bulk of decorative and useful elements. Strangely enough, Hake's collages in a way resemble Giovanni Battista Piranesi's critical attitude towards the excesses produced by the advent of pure arbitrariness of late Baroque, well, or at least partially. Not only the apparent reference to horror vacui, but also what Manfredo Tafuri notices when Piranesi enlarges, I quote Tafuri, some architectural particulars, accessories, or work tools which, extracted from their context, often assume the appearance of surrealistic object through base. End of quote. Jacques' rolling project constitutes, just as Trafuri refers to Piranesi's carceri, for example, a systematic, and here I quote again Tafuri, a systematic criticism of the concept of place, end of quote. This is a truly, in the case of Haki, not only metaphorical architecture of heterotopia. And here lies the ultimate object, I will argue, of design and of desire. Once the infinite infrastructure has turned to the common edificatory problems obsolete, ornament in itself acquires a new transcendental dimension. And once again, the strange coincidence of Piranesi and Hake demonstrates in plenitude the individuality of decoration as a synthesis of pragmatic problems and the sublimation of architecture's symbolic nature. Comparing Piranesi's altar of San Basilio in Santa Maria del Priorato sul Aventino Church in Rome, which is what we are seeing now, with Hake's central bathroom in his rolling house, it becomes evident their formal coincidence in functioning as isolated objects that produce a deliberate fractioning of the spatial continuum of the organism. Moreover, just as Piranesi's altar increases its theatricality, theatricality by virtue of its isolation, Hake's bathtub is promoted as the central ornament piece, which will come to full terms once a hypothetical voyeuristic shower is consumed. We can only imagine the bathtub fully functioning. The central act of taking a bath will become part of the decoration, reminiscent of the Piranesian San Basilio with his angels. While San Basilio coincides figuratively and formally with Jack Hackey's Blacktooth, it is in the backside wherein, according to Tafuti, the premonition of the transcendental phenomenological role of architecture is declared. Therefore, while Hackey's rolling house could be described as an arquitectura parlante of heterotopia, since its hybrid hyperdecoration announces engagement with the others, the marginalized aspects of architecture and society in a general sense. On the contrary, San Basilio constitutes the double object that on the front shows off irrationality produced by the excess of decoration, and on its backside, the possible way out of this irrationality, the transcendence of pure original language and pure enlightened primordial experience in the sublime. It is no coincidence, of course, as it is well known, that the purification of architectural experience comes with references to death as the primary source of transcendental encounter, which might also be true for Aurelius, like a Rolling Stone project, uh, though Aurelius rejects any phenomenological affection. In the end, the individual chambers in like a Rolling Stone sublimate the role of the irrelevant frame in which they reside. They assume the transcendental symbolism of the house tomb, unable to hate its phenomenological pretensions. Uh, um, this is architectura parlante, in this case, that has been reduced to enlarged phenomenological furniture, even though Dogma has embraced the project from the point of view of economic justice for the post for this worker. The project reduces the problem to a lack of a specific housing type, solved through a pure architectural event. In other words, the problem that instigates the architectural proposal is the settlement of an existential void, and it acts as the backdrop for the birth of a new transcendental object. To paraphrase Slavoj Zizek, the sublime can conceal and even make undesirable conditions seductive, especially for enlightened architects in this case, that despite the uncomfortable factual circumstances of a minimum space inside the chambers of like a Rolling Stone, should recognize the pure encounter with the abstract aesthetics of architecture. Hackey and Aureli stand at opposite sides in a dialectic relation. Both of them recognize the little agency that architecture has in changing the world, and they have sublimated architectural problems to more modest aims. We can try one last interpretation, understanding the different aesthetic approaches when providing two distinct narrative forms. If we think of content as the conventional architectural tools, we have two excessive narratives in these two projects that try to make a declaration about architecture. Indeed, both projects have been described by the authors in manifesto-like text. In Hackey's case, the acceptance of melodrama kitsch is paradoxically what keeps it floating without fully becoming architecture. And by architecture, I mean a discipline occasionally defined by certain rules. It is the prolongation of the transcendental rupture of the object trouvé modern avant-garde. At the end of the manifesto-like declaration of Hackey's rolling project, he uses melodrama and excess of content as a metaphor for the way the new parliamentarian domestic space will function. However, just as has been adverted by Enrique Walker in his manifesto Requiem, entitled What Happened to the Architectural Manifesto, I quote Enrique Walker, the manifesto ultimately condemns the project to be merely its illustration. End of quote. That is, in this case, in the case of Hackey, a melodrama. Hackey's rolling manifesto updates the 70s radical positions and describes a positive attitude, mixing retroactivity with complexity and kitsch. The excessive narrative avoids opposing directly in content per se architectural position. It has no declared enemies. On the other hand, even though Aureli has declared his historical allies and enemies in the Manifesto Architecture Reviews, declaiming the Manifesto Marathon at the Serpentine Gallery in 2008, it ultimately becomes nostalgic, a nostalgic negative wish list based on a reinterpretation of Ad Reinhardt's abstract art refuses of 1953. Aurelius' manifesto was utterly at odds with the evident cliched form of a marathon for manifestos. The true radical position would have been a truly I prefer not to, especially considering the no-architect as banal monkeys and the no-nostalgia claimed by Aureli in the same manifesto. Nevertheless, this weird mixture of negation and engagement with the architectural establishment is probably a way to remain operative in a kind of servile virtuosity, generating not only resistance, but also market-driven possibilities as an unexpected byproduct. Advancing coherent positions might be not enough when radicalism has to be sacrificed. And in this image, I will conclude these two projects by engaging in an operative disciplinary solution of the rolling problem, a home for the rootless contemporary worker and the contemporary immigrant, which the real estate market has overlooked. Both projects perilously offer a product ready to be incorporated within market-driven logics. Nevertheless, it seems that the radical nostalgia and realistic language of dogma in Like a Rolling Stone are more consumable since it makes the rationality of the prototype relatively easy and simple to be deployed, not to mention the seductive and sublime feature of abstraction as both a synonym of sophistication and as a consumption object, both within and outside the discipline. On the other hand, the labeling of unconventional objects at the stage of architecture or the decorative multi-scalar feature of Hacke's rolling house makes it more difficult to be deployed and consumed, since despite his design objects are radically new, they are not covered in phantasmagorical images of innovation. In the rolling house for the rolling society, ordinary objects play their usual role, therefore making it purposely controversial, but at the same time making it resonate with the current instability of prejudiced social conventions in general. While Aurelius proposes conservative objects to solve urgent contemporary problems, Hackett questions the architectural object's conventional purpose. While the first project claims to be a solution to contemporary capitalist forms of exploitation, it fails to oppose strategically the system that promotes it. Meanwhile, Hackett's project that focuses on giving a contingent solution to the rolling problem with ordinary everyday objects, paradoxically cannot avoid reanimating the ghosts of utopia by virtue of the controversies it inaugurates. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Marco. You went a little bit beyond the 15 minutes, but it's not dramatic. So thank you very much. I discovered I cannot raise my hand, but just clap. So I will clap you when the 15 minutes are over. So yeah, thank you. By the way, I invite the audience to write any question in the chat, even while the presentations take place, so that I can gather them and elaborate in the debate time. So thank you, Marco. I really liked the quiet tone of your voice in contrast with the corrosive content of your paper, which is that was amazing. So maybe we'll go back to that later. Now let's invite our next speakers, which are Magda, Maria. I'm not sure Magda is here, but yeah, I see.
Yes,
Silvia.
yes, she's here. She's here with me.
Hello,
Hello.
Magda.
Hello.
Hello, it's a pleasure to see you. So Magda and Silvia Musquera, Magda Maria and Silvia Musquera, they are both teachers of architectural design at ETSAM in Barcelona. So, and they are bringing here their teaching experience closely related to the comparative, dual comparative methods, right? So thank you both, and the floor is yours.
Direct ability to describe in words the visible certainties or the invisible threats that relate to works of very different origins, conditions, and characteristics aspires to become at the end of the academic year, a permanent learning, a kind of daily reflection that allows in the future to face reality in another way. In Berger's words, the point is looking again as if it were the first time, but without neglecting what was learned along the path of experience and life. This assumed exercise that improves the comparison, contrast, parallelism, or confrontation between images thus becomes a mechanism for feeding our cultural background, our criticism ability, and our design tools. The last one. And for keeping them active, one of the recommended practices is the continuous re-elaboration of our own ontology, a personal and non-transferable compilation of comparable images in which we recognize ourselves and build an open imaginary museum. A collection of buildings, paintings, sculptures, objects, text, musical fragments, or scenes in which, far from the classical showcases, the connections between forms, rhythms, concepts, or words are in permanently activity, open to new interpretations and relationships, and consequently to new comparisons. Thank you.
Thank you, Silvia and Magda. That was a fantastic presentation. This is probably the most strictly methodological contribution to the conference. So it's at the core of the conference, in my opinion, this contribution. I found really relevant this idea of this very bold and optimistic idea of transversality. We will go back to it in the debate, I hope. And you are raising awareness on the even on the limits of the comparative method, which is very interesting. So congratulations also for your teaching this architectural design studio, right? This is the content of an architectural design studio.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Wonderful. Wonderful. So I
Thank
think
you.
we can. Let's move on to our next speaker, which is Gabriel Elias de Souza, who is also an architect and a professor at the Department of Architecture and Urban Planning in the Universidade Federal de Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Is that right, Gabriel?
Universidade Federal Rural de Rio de Janeiro.
Ah, rural. Oh, sorry,
Rural.
sorry. I am too urban, I'm afraid.
Yeah, this right here.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. So Gabriel, you are presenting a quite accurate research comparing two books by architects. So we are willing to listen to your presentation. The floor is yours.
Okay. Well, first of all, good morning. I'm very satisfied to be in this meeting. And in this presentation, I want to share with you some reflections born out of my PhD research oriented by Professor Otávio Leonidio and concluded almost 6 years ago. First of all, I must begin stating that mediatization is a foundational aspect of architecture. The construction of a public, collectively shared notion of what architecture is relies heavily in pictures and words, but also on the tools available for the reproduction and circulation of those pictures and those words, that is, in mass media. From Vitruvius to Palladio to Le Corbusier to Ren Koolhaas, the achievement of a larger reputation has been closely related to the architect's engagement to writing and publishing. And the recent phenomenon of international star architecture is especially unthinkable without skillful and constant involvement with mass media. That being said, one can ask, what is the rhetorical function of the shape given to the media used by architects? How contemporary architectural discourse relates to the design of its own medium. I have been examining that problem considering specifically the medium of the printed book since the last 90s. Books that are written and organized by the architects themselves can aspire to be considered also a part of the work. If buildings and designs carry the signature of architects, books can carry their distinctive voice and their ethos. Then, when treated itself as a product of design, the book artifact can work as a synecdoche of an office's character, building a somewhat verbographic synergy between the body of work and the body of discourse. In that sense, the production of books can help architects to build their own professional identities, and they can also be used to build and announce their commercial brands. Following the dualistic proposal of this Congress, I intend to address that theme by comparing books from two globally famed architects. One is SML-XL, Small, Medium, Large, Extra Large, from Dutch architect Brent Koolhaas and his Office for Metropolitan Architecture, or OMA. And the other is Yes is More, an Archicomic on Architectural Evolution, from Danish architect Bjarke Ingels and his Bjarke Ingels Group, or BIG, or BIG. Those two cases have wide differences in terms of context, style, scope, depth, refinement, and disciplinary relevance. But nevertheless, they share some fundamental similarities. The two were the first self-organized monograph of their respective practices, and both were instrumental for each office's rise to stardom. Both were also designed in a primarily performative way, which is treating form as content to express aspects of each studio's character. Those convergences were not accidental, for Yes is More is part of SML-XL's offspring. Being one of the best-selling books in the history of architecture publishing, SML-XL boosted the multiplication of a particular profile of architectural book since the mid-90s. Graphically provocative volumes organized by architectural studios themselves that were inclined to overlap the retrospective functions of the monograph with the prospective and controversial tones of the manifesto, operating at the same time as a looking back recollection and as a future-oriented statement about the architecture profession. However, SML-XL's influence goes beyond the publishing context, for many of the followers of that monograph as manifesto strain were former associates at OMA. That's the case of Bjarke Ingels, who worked at OMA between 1998 and 2001. But even before that, SML-XL had already helped to make Koolhaas part of the architectural canon to Ingels' generation of architects. In short, there's little doubt that Yes is More could ever exist without SML-XL. I'll consider now I shall examine some convergences and disparities between those two publications regarding the rhetorical role that book design played in each case. Due to time limitations, only a few key aspects will be addressed in this presentation. Well, the most immediately remarkable aspect of SML-XL's design is its sheer bulk and weight, resembling the monumentality associated with sacred books. OMA's mammoth monograph forms a stiff and dense block of information enveloped in a cryptic and purely typographic silver hardcover. The reading experience demands exclusivity. The reading experience demands exclusivity, obligating the users to stand still and lean the book against some steady surface. In comparison, Yes is More is much less bookish and much less physical publication, offering the first impression of a thick magazine or a graphic novel. The book avoids any monumentality and embraces more casual, cheap, and jovial looks, with its high contrasting black and white cover displaying architecture immersed in a mood as a sci-fi pulp or a superhero comic book. The plain and cohesive exterior of SML-XL is in deep contrast with its strikingly varied and picture-flooded interior. The book contains a plurality of 53 individual episodes that include essays, narratives, manifestos, and, first and foremost, presentations of built and unbuilt designs. Grouped in large sections by scale, hence the name of the book, small, medium, large, extra large, the book is a sum of singularities. Each episode has its own distinctive design and can be remarkably different from the others in every single aspect of graphic communication. Oh, sorry, I'm really lost here. Oh, inside every single aspect of graphic communication. By that I mean iconography, typography, layout, pacing, printing, and etc. The book still includes a cross-sectional structure called dictionary, which is an independent stream of verbal and iconographic quotations that run almost randomly through the book and invade the pages of the episodes, interfering, interrupting, and even giving new meanings to their contents. Through thought it is kind of disrupting, in the long run, that dictionary ironically becomes one of the main elements of coherence in the book. In comparison, the structure of Yes is More is plain and simple. Unlike SML-XL, all the 35 chapters of BIG's book are presentations of built and unbuilt projects. And all of them are modulated in a very similar way, as a narrative lecture being given by Bjarke Ingels himself, composed by pictures and words assembled within the conventions of comic book language, with speech bubbles and all, resulting in a series of look-alike photonovels, or as Ingels call them, archicomics. SML-XL's design was keenly concerned with medium specificity. As the designer Bruce Mau stated, the book was conceived as an artifact to be experienced. The turning of the pages was treated like a cinematic mechanism of montage, conveying shocks, flows, and pauses. The party of its design considered the structure of the book as an architectural subject in which to accumulate complexity. SML-XL, for example, could not ever be transformed into an ebook without losing many of its core qualities. The design party of Yes is More, on the other hand, was not in the medium of the book per se, but primarily in the comics genre. The comic strip pages of Yes is More were peacefully transferred to tablet screens and exposition panels without losing any of its defining aspects. This versatility was indeed part of its conception. The deeply customized presentations of SML-XL took years-long efforts of graphic invention, whereas Ingels' recourse to comics, in contrast, arrived as a quick and efficient way to translate his already made videos and slideshow presentations to book form. They also enabled Ingels to achieve an eye-catching differentiator without having to overthink the actual design of the book. And with that, it allowed a 4,000-page book to be composed in only 6 weeks. Despite the differences in the way the design of each book deals with medium materiality and the studio's identity, both cases relate to a form as content attitude that binds the performance of the book with the attitude and the identity of the office. For example, the structure and experience design in SML-XL are oriented to the incorporation of those metropolitan qualities that OMA claims to explore and nurture in its building proposals. Some of the most easily recognizable architecture features are the effects of the stream bigness as described by Kohlhaas, which includes automatic acquisition of blank monumentality by sheer size, the divorce between exterior and interior without the outer envelope as main element of cohesion, the individualization of inner parts as autonomous projects, and the acquisition of relationship by sheer juxtaposition. All those effects of bigness, architectonic effects of bigness, are promptly enacted by SMLXL design itself. The idea of performance is also central to Big's conception of yes is more. Even though the book was not conceived as an architecture-like artifact, it is important to note that it does incorporate important features of Big architectural attitude. Along many of BIG's design presentations, there are at least 3 general aspects that seem to legitimate practically all design decisions of the group. The first is performativity, which I call the tendency to form to be always justified through its practical performance, programmatic, climatic, ecologic, constructive, or economic. The second aspect is iconicity. That is, as a logotype, form in BIG always follows some bold, simple, and unifying gestures or visual metaphors. And the third is accessibility. Form must be entertaining, relatable, and accessible to a lay audience. All those architectural features can be seen in Yes is More usage of the comic strip language. After all, it is a form option that, rooted in practical reasons, clearly and distinctively affects the way the book performs as a whole. It is also iconic for its plain, recognizable, and boldly distinctive. And it is also accessible because it's readable, relatable, and entertaining, even for people with modest architectural knowledge. But there is another aspect of performativity in Yes is More. One main reason for Engels to use comics was the possibility of controlling the pacing and emphasis of the reading experience, which enable a more efficient translation of the subtleties of orality, presence, and rhythm of Engels' presential lectures. Therefore, the performance that Yes is More was made to enact was curiously less one of architecture than that performance of the architect himself. At this point, it must be highlighted that the pairing made in this paper contrasted not exactly only the 2 offices, but a specific moment in their professional history, that of a turning point in each other's constitution of a public architectural self. Each book played a different role in that constitution. We can say that the intense process of self-reflection and self-representation spent in the making of SMLXL matched an effort to professional reinvention of OMA. But Yes is More case, in its turn, was more an enterprise of brand building. That is, the placement of an already arranged self within a public awareness.
Who is Nicola. As you know, Nicola has a recorded video. Nicola is a journalist, if I'm not wrong. Yeah.
Yes,
And,
that's it.
and now he's working on his PhD dissertation, right? In the USP.
Yes, it's University of São Paulo. It's a School of Communication and Arts. So I come from film studies. I'm going to stream now my presentation. It deals with images, moving images. So I ask you to enter the speaker view function of the Zoom. I won't be using PowerPoint. So to be able to see it full screen and the films I've edited. So
we all have to mute our microphones
as well, please. So yeah. Just a sec.
You can change the view mode in the upper.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this panel. I have recorded this previously because I want to show you bits of films and photographs. And I thought it would be too complicated using the screen sharing, which actually does not work very well when we deal with moving images. Things appear chopped and not really well rendered. So I have recorded this, but I'm listening to this live, and I expect questions of you if you have any. Well, I should also mention that I'm not, this research that I'm presenting comes from film studies at the School of Communication at the University of São Paulo. So I do feel a little bit out of my depth, but I hope you will appreciate it. Mm-hmm. I intended to, actually by submitting a paper for this event, I intended to make a peculiar film more broadly acknowledged by the public in general, but especially by all those interested in architecture. This film deals with what is today a familiar subject, the Pompidou Center in Paris. However, its fame and success, especially if by success we mean the overwhelming presence of the public, was not so obvious at the time of the inauguration in 1977, January actually. I think most here are familiar with the building, so I will not spend too much time describing it. It is important to remember that the design by Renzo Piano and Richard Rogers was also shocking to many locals because it was made in stark contrast to the old city. Some earlier modernist buildings consisted of clear rectangular forms with sleek surfaces made of concrete, transparent glass, or steel. This is, of course, a kind of a general definition of modernist architecture. But in a sense, the Pompidou Center was deliberately different. It was as if the exterior rectangular planes were pushed deeply inside, so the internal elements could be revealed. Things that one usually finds hidden inside a wall or behind a ceiling were proudly made visible and in bright colors, so the facade resembles an agitated thread of intertwined segments of pipes, conduits, stairways, and terraces. Of course, there is a history to this kind of exposed utilitarian elements, one that goes back at least to the British brutalism. However, those visible features made the Pompidou building highly elusive. While looking at it, one could think of a machine, of a refinery, a strange ship with periscopes, or, as Rainer Banham noted at that time, something coming out of the Beatles song, The Yellow Submarine, a monument with the pop sensibility. Putting out and making visible the things that usually go invisible also allowed for a vast, unobstructed, and highly adaptable interior. This could be interpreted as something freeing and inclusive. Some intellectuals, however, most notably Jean Baudrillard, would perceive the opposite. According to the French philosopher, once inaugurated, the new institution not only failed to promote culture, but celebrated its deep coma, to which numerous visitors merely paid respects. They walked beside artworks as if they were in a supermarket or an amusement park. The building was, in a sense, a spectacle in itself, and the deep anachronism in relation to the contents, such as 19th century paintings, for example, annihilated the alleged purposes. Later, the Beaubourg effect, as Baudrillard called this phenomenon, would be perceived by authors as changing paradigm, a shift that paved way for more of the so-called new museums, a term that is critically used here in Brazil by the researcher Otílio Arantes. A certain museophobia, a skepticism of museums characteristic of the earlier 20th century avant-gardes, would change profoundly after the late 70s to become a museomania, an enthusiastic search by aspiring global
cities for monumental, iconic, and spectacular buildings. Even franchises emerged, most notoriously with the construction of the Guggenheim in Bilbao in 1997. This formula of investment in culture and oddly shaped buildings that could revitalize and bring economic growth to cities was ultimately named Bilbao effect. Neoliberalism, in a sense. The elusive power of these initiatives became so strong that the inauguration of the Pompidou Center Gallery in Shanghai in 2010 has been described as museum diplomacy. As recently as last week, CNN ran a large piece about the new Louvre that is due to open in Abu Dhabi. But Parisian Pompidou was a first, and at the time there was uncertainty. Press and intellectuals all seemed to be against it. The filmmaker and producer Jacques Grant-Claude recalls that those involved in the inauguration thought no one would come given the polemics. Without the consent of the Pompidou directors, the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs took initiative to make a film, and Roberto Rossellini, a widely recognized and reputable film director, was approached. Jacques Grant-Claude, already involved in some commissions for the ministry, was brought in as a producer. The shooting with an experienced crew took a week, ending on May 6th. After presiding the jury at Cannes Film Festival later that month, Rossellini returned to Rome. He died a few days later, in 6th of June, while preparing Lavorare per Umanità, Working for Humanity, a project based on the early adulthood of Karl Marx. The film entitled Beaubourg, Center of Art and Culture, Georges Pompidou, is the last film directed by Rossellini. One might think of it as the first and perhaps the best testimony of the museum emerging as a contemporary mass phenomenon. The film is structured as a straightforward guided tour. It is mostly a succession of around 70 long takes that navigate through different publicly accessible parts of the institution, registering the surroundings and the behavior of the public. There is no voiceover narration or spoken interviews. Many visitors are quiet and inexpressive, but some are frequently dispersed or simply lost. In the penultimate sequence, a woman in red coat wanders randomly among exhibits and is ultimately captivated by the Parisian view from the window. This brings us back to the comments made by Baudrillard. The pretended openness and freedom may have resulted in irresolution and confusion rather than an emancipatory experience. Although these aspects are present in the Rossellini's film, it ultimately takes a much broader and inquisitive approach. It also does not really function as propaganda or an illustration of a prescribed use in institutional or architectural sense. Visual and sound information are gathered in long takes and are frequently presented in contradiction. This is what I am trying to describe as critical approach, not of course in tradition of the critical theory, but as a peculiar method of approaching reality with film. As I will try to show you in the next clip, this involves a special technique of camera movement. Usually when we describe films, we speak about something that happened, or in other words, we refer to narration that develops from an action and the time required by that action to take place. As I have said previously, in this film, the behavior of the public is the main happening, the ever-changing activity of people approached by the film. However, the engagement of the camera itself inscribes a temporality of its own, that in most cases is not determined by the visible world. The long take we have seen is organized around few subjects that might be considered as reference points: the Pantheon, the Eiffel Tower, the Capricorn sculpture by Max Ernst, the wide view towards the building, two more pieces by Max Ernst, the Assistant and the Grand Assistant, the Gerberette and the horizontal trusses, and at the end the warm interior gallery space. The action that links these points is a varying and fluid movement of the viewpoint. It is obtained by associating camera movements such as panning, tilting, and traveling with another kind of movement that doesn't involve displacement of the camera, the change of focal length, or as we usually call it, zooming. Italian film historian and critic Adriano Pra said, correctly and succinctly, that zoom behaves as abstracted gaze that moves without moving. By this apparent paradox, Appra meant that unlike a body set in three-dimensional space, its anthropomorphic metaphor being a film camera, movement produced by zooming involves a different kind of perceptual quality. To manage all this, Rossellini established a technique of his own. Without looking through the lens, Rossellini sat beside the shooting crew and manipulated a lever directly connected to the camera. This meant that he could zoom in or out anytime he wanted, reacting to the scene, guided by feeling and intuition. This also means that the image is a result of combined actions and movements of multiple physical bodies. Neither of those can reclaim total control of the framed image, so that the movements are guided and fluid, yet they maintain a lightly dispersed quality. Objects may be approached, although never stabilized in a frame. The movement is enduring, and the space becomes volatile. Fleeting observation induces tensions and stirs expectations. In this sequence, the multiple features of the gallery space and the various art exhibits constantly enter and exit the frame. The overlapping of different walls, the appearances of distinct paintings, the sparkles of natural light in the kinetic sculpture, all these things present themselves as elements of surprise. The flow is calm and constant, yet what it searches for is unpredictable. Why is image going closer to this thing and not the other? Throughout the film, perception is built in anticipation, as form of visual suspense. Something is anticipated, and then it appears. It is anticipated, and then it appears. The ambient sound is an elaborate mix from sources captured on location and thoroughly rearranged in post-production. They operate in disjunction with the image as corresponding complement, frequently with repetitive noises. More importantly, the spoken commentary portrays spontaneous reactions. These remarks cannot be attributed to any person visible in the image, preserving the sense of the public as something general. Some voices are very judgmental and negative, like the one that says, "Hyperrealism is unbearable," or the other one that says, "Shit, I say shit when I say that, no kidding, seriously." Institutional voices usually provide practical information, such as the receptionist and the guide. Workers can be heard arranging details before the opening. To sum things up, given the duration, a series of heterogeneous elements are grasped in the same shot. No assertive interpretation comes from these combinations of statues, paintings, installations, exhibiting settings, panorama terraces, moving escalators, tension columns, lattice beams, and many visitors, although sometimes contrasts and disconnections seem to be deliberately emphasized. Beaubourg, the film, poses these problems with a distanced view, as observed disjunction, where perhaps a connection, a bond, can be established by the film itself. The calm and steady pace of the varying observation reclaims a temporality of its own, something that is perhaps an instance of asynchrony. Time is mostly not defined by the gestures belonging to the observed world, but in spite of it, by the act of gazing, resulting in tension and suspense. The truly critical aspect of this approach, therefore, is not merely social, registering the behavior of the public or the gentrification of the old neighborhood, but also engaging with the location, its geometry, texture, color, space, and sounds. Achieving this through a special technique is precisely not abiding to established conventions of publicity. The overall feeling of distance and inquiry in this film seems not less critical, but still more generous than the statements made by someone like Baudrillard, for example. The recessed vision is a step back that asks us to approach the world with new eyes, to adhere to a different temporality, so we can be able to think. There is no real plot in this film. If for narrativity to take place, an event must happen, then the main occurrence, the overarching action that gives this film cohesion, is precisely the itinerary itself, or as I have been considering, a story of perceptual experience. That's it, I guess.
Okay. Thank you, Nicola. It is interesting to think about this mediated condition for parallel.
That was in a sense my intent. Interesting information about Rossellini is that in the 70s he made a film about the Medici period of the Italian history. So actually he made scenes where Leon Battista Alberti would explain the functionings of the Renaissance perspective. But at that time he already employed this kind of zooming that I was speaking about. So there is this contradiction of the way he approaches this kind of graphical representation developed by Alberti, and that was in case used for architecture. So if you remember, many of the perspectival uses of the system were in the history of art, for instance, were made to render, to actually show buildings, cities, and urban places. So, but interestingly, Rossellini, when he approaches them with film, he doesn't try to recreate that with the film frame. He would actually use this kind of fluid movements inside the scene. So there is this kind of contradiction in the way which he approaches architecture. And in a way, he does this with the Pompidou building. So you will never see anything shot from the eye level or trying to obey kind of a structure, geometric structure. Things are always reconfigured and fluid. And I think it's interesting. It makes the film difficult to understand it, difficult to use in terms of publicity, in terms of simulacrum. Things are too long, they take too much time to just be shown on TV, for example, or things like that. So that is why, that is kind of approach I was trying to bring to the panel.
Yeah, at the same time you show that film can be a medium for criticism of architecture.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And you make this parallel with Baudrillard's statements, right? Which is very interesting at the end of your paper. But let me try to develop this question about the source materials, the kind of format of these objects to compare or to put in parallel, and also about the distance between objects, because we have seen in the case, for example, of Marco, this very distant in history and also in language and discipline subjects. He is able to compare, especially when the Tafuri, Piranesi, even Boulez show up, right, in your paper. And also in the case of Magda and Silvia, you make your statement about transversality. So I was wondering, do you think there is some kind of relation between these choices and the goal of the method? Like, for example, operative or educational goals may be calling for this kind of transversality, diachronic comparisons, whereas research or critical goals may call for closer objects to compare, like in the case of, we have found in the case of Gabriel, or in the case of Nicola, which are objects very close one to the other. In the case of Nicola, one is the source of the other. In the case of Gabriel, there is a direct genealogy. I would like to know your opinion.
Is it for me or for
it's for everyone. I see you are. I thank your level of activity, Nicola. You are helping me a lot.
Maybe I can help a bit in this question. I think the interesting part in these exercises of comparison is that, for example, in the case that I was developing, these two practices have a really strong discourse about architecture. No? So when you only look at architectural evidence, you begin to dislocate the discourse from the actual objects, and you can actually begin to find new ways to interpret these practices. No? So, for example, what I was trying to do was to put these two practices in a rather more canonical, let's say, formal approach to even if these two practices try to separate their architectural aims from they just want to posit like new political positions in the architectural project. So I think that the comparisons in this case may use images not only to judge the examples by how they look similar, but how they may be encouraging other type of aims. No, so it's like a way to dislocate discourse from object, I will say. So I think that's the value of beginning to relocate, let's say, the criticism by comparison. No, so but in a way, I think it's different from, for example, canonical examples like Colin Rowe's mathematics of the ideal villain. No? So because he was trying to, in a way, find like the canon, how the canon was even present, like the Palladian canon even present in Le Corbusier. So here, I think we are approaching other types of critical approach, like what happened when these critical discourses are overlooked and we only look at objects, and what we can interpret about these comparisons. No?
Mm. Yeah, you are bringing up Colin Rowe, and I am sure Magda and Silvia can say something about this, because in fact my question is about to what extent this kind of interpretation or criticism you, Marco, are mentioning is a subjective construction. It's a kind of third object which is relatively independent of the other two objects, and so it can be also become, of course, operative, but also can become rhetorical, or the object of manipulation, like, for example, Rowe reframing Le Corbusier in a classical tradition. I had to say that. Sorry.
Well, we in our subject we show the students that the comparison is a project. It's like a project, because when is a main design instrument too. But when we compare, we design because the product of the comparison between two buildings or two work of art is a third building, a third work of art, a new entity. And the students must first deconstruction the two objects and to reconstruction the two objects in the third object, that is the comparison. And this method is very creative, critical creative, but also original creative. And the plot, the argument that they must do are the structure that create the comparison. And with this method, I think that Marco Salazar has been very clear. You can comparison anything, but in our case, when we choose the images, we don't analyze a very long time. We intuitively choose this image, and then with a comparison, appear a large or a very great number of casualties and coincidences in his history, in his authors, in his reference. The image are magic. Great comparison is magic.
So, if I understand it well, because you have an operative goal, right? Like designing, one could say every pair of images would go. I mean, would be okay, no? So it would be productive in that sense, no? But we have seen Nicolas and Gabriel's papers. In my opinion, they have a different character because they have very close subjects to compare and to parallel, and I wonder if this is related to the goal of producing a shared and stable knowledge about the objects themselves. Like in the case of Gabriel, this is quite evident and it's closer to a research goal, maybe, no? What do you think, Gabriel? Oh.
Well, I think it's pretty right in that sense. The comparison was, in my case, was a way to achieve knowledge about the object, but also to think, to try to pick a strain of objects and try to understand what is happening temporally between them. My research involves my original research involves more books, and to pair those two has to do with what criticality we can have about both similarities and disparities. But I must agree with Sylvia and Magda about the validity of comparing anything you put one close to other. I think there's something. I'm a reader of Kohlhaas, and then I think there's something rich when you just oppose something randomly with others, something, and then you have to work. What do I take from this? Because it's the metropolitan condition according to Kohlhaas, and that's a learning principle that I as a professor use all the time to compare things, to using one thing to illuminate another. Sometimes those things works as poles. Sometimes they are just slightly different. Sometimes they can seem not to have anything in common. In my case, the case of my paper and my research, yes, the pairing was constructed with the goal. But sometimes I think the comparison is the goal itself, as a way, as a methodology of thinking. I think it is very rich to think that way. Because the comparison, we can, when we see the work of Nicola, the movie and the architecture through the movie, but you can think, what is there in seeing a movie that is different from the architecture per se? Because cinema that has this quality of the most elusive of artists, because it really can fool us into reality. They make me believe that it's happening. That it's just images and sound, but it's more than any other art form. Or maybe video game, but that's another thing. But it takes us all. But cinema is very structured, very more structured than architecture itself. I mean, the perception, architecture. That's the thing. That's the thing about representing architecture and registering architecture and drawing and photograph and etc. Architecture needs representation to be conceived, and needs representation to be communicated, and needs representation to be understood, not to be used, but to be understood. That's the point. As representation is the tool for architects to think about architecture, representations are also the tool for people in general to really understand what architecture is about. That's my opinion. The object is kind of dumb, not in the sense of stupid, but in the sense of mute. Architecture is kind of a mute object who's there, who's a scenery. Sometimes it's in your face and it shouts. Sometimes it's just mute, but you can't really understand what it's like. That's why architects write books, to make the thing. Oh, I thought of that when I do that you're seeing is because this and that. All the intentions of architects are not clearly visible in architecture itself, in the building environment. I know I think I kind of lost the trail here.
Oh, wonderful. I don't know. We have a question by Luis to, I think, to Magda and Silvia. Maybe Nicola wants to add something to that, and otherwise we.
How do you relate or not your pedagogical method based?
Oh, no. I meant to Gabriel's comment.
I'm sorry. I thought you were asking me about the chat.
No.
And I agree in general with Gabriel. So yes, indeed, I think I agree. Any two things can be compared. My question is this comparison makes them sharper or not? I mean, more clearly understood or debated or contradicted, whatever you want. And yes, in this sense, I'm trying. My perspective is coming from film studies, actually, more than understanding of the inner mechanics or construction of the Pompidou building. Then the other part of this research deals with this cultural phenomenon of mass museum, where Pompidou is important. This is why I bring Baudrillard. And this is kind of a historical context. If we could look things even more broadly and think, for instance, the relationship of mass media towards the presentation of art, and you could compare architecture and film. So film usually, not usually, but there is tradition in film, the art film, that tries to be pedagogic about paintings, sculptures, and other artistic artifacts. And architecture, museum architecture, in a sense, has to deal with all this. And when you go into this territory, you're dealing with all those old questions about context, reification, if art is relation between art and mass media. So in this sense, Pompidou and Rossellini, who also had this big project of televisual pedagogy. He made many films for television in 60s and 70s. We could eventually try to compare this in this broader sense of mass culture, relationship between art and mass culture.
Fantastic, Nicola. sorry to interrupt you.
No.
We're running out of time. I'm sorry we don't have more time, but the written questions in the chat you can maybe answer through other media, and I keep them anyway. So I must say thank you to you all, and we have to close now this panel, and I'm looking forward to meet you in the next one. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Enjoy.
Thank
you very
you,
much.
Sergio.
Thank
you.
Bye. Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you
Bye.
all. Thank you all for this great panel. We're now closing this room, and everyone will be directed to a waiting room. Okay, you will be able to return to this same room once the next panel begins in about 30 minutes. Okay, we invite you all to keep participating in the conference activity, and I hope to see many of you after the lunch break. Thank you very much. And Professor Sergio Blas, I'm sorry again for the confusing the moderator in the beginning of this.
It's wonderful. For 1 second, I thought Nicola was gonna do my job. It's wonderful.
I'm so sorry. Thank you all.
Okay, thank you, Akemi.
Thank you.